Hello and welcome to my presentation on the intersection of improv and composition. This is an analysis of post-tonal flute solos from improvising performer composers, people who perform primarily but also have contributed a significant amount of compositions to the larger flute repertory. So this will include a comparative analysis using the experimental composition, improvisation, and continuum model. We will first introduce this model, which was introduced by Alister Spence, and then we'll practice applying the model in different improvisational pieces, and also using it to compare a performer's improvisation against their compositional process or results. We will be performing an analysis on 3 different composers: Robert Dick, Greg Patillo, and Wil Offermans, all very different types of players, but they all improvise as a means of starting their compositions and even as parts of their compositions, but they all come up with very different results. So the ECIC model, or the Experimental Composition Improvisation Continuum model, this is used by Alister Spence in their journal, The Experimental Composition Improvisation Continuum Model, A Tool for Musical Analysis, which was published in the Frontiers in Psychology, Volume 12. And what it does is it's a qualitative tool, which is subjective. So if you're looking for a quantitative tool, there are many other types of tools, usually using computers and software tracking to help measure improvisation practices. But this one is a subjective tool meant to be used as a comparative analysis. So it acts as a means of observing interactions and continua between improvisation and composition, as well as more and less experimentally conceived music. So it can be used to illuminate certain experimental interactions, including chance, indeterminism, and contingency, which we will define and elaborate on shortly. It can also consider like different practices and processes and then the outcomes that they produce, and allow you to find the answers to questions such as what are some clear interpenetrations or deviations that you might notice between two or more pieces or sections of the music. It can also be used to track the perception of the composer, the performer, and the audience based on different psychoacoustical properties in the performance or the recording. And it can allow you to understand how the piece can be perceived, and then in what ways you can leverage that perception for a more effective performance. So the first axis we will talk about is the experimental axis. So this is our vertical line. On the bottom, we have less experimental, which is having no engagement with contingency, chance, or indeterminism, which again, we will get into shortly. And then the top is more experimental, which is completely engaged with contingency, chance, and indeterminism. The horizontal axis is our composition to improvisation axis. And Spence actually quotes Nettle in their 1974 article about composition and improvisation. He quotes them in saying the juxtaposing of composition, improvisation as fundamentally different processes is false. The two are part of the same idea. And then Spence goes on to quote Hamilton, who agrees with this and argues further that such works occupy a continuum, and there is in important respects a fluid contrast between composed work and improvisation. So there's a fluid continuum between improvisation and composition, where you can have something that is completely premeditated and notated and like used as a blueprint basically, to the other side of the continuum, which is improv. And that would be the immediate in the moment performance that would rely on a lot more contingencies generally, but also has a level of unexpectedness, not just from the audience who may have never heard such a performance, but also from the performer who is using their intuition and their kind of gut feelings to create a piece of work. So contingency, I've used this term a couple of times already. This is an umbrella term for events decided according to nonlinear causality. So instead of just reading the piece of paper, there might be these things that come up that cause you to react in the moment. And these can be different techniques, mechanisms, processes, and actions. They can be intentional, they can be unintentional, they can be planned prior, they can be planned in the moment. They really don't have contingencies, really don't have much limitations. So this is a phenomenon that causes every improvisation to be what Spence says is non-trivially different. So it goes without saying that every person who's improvising is going to have a different result. And then even a singular person improvising is going to have a different result between different moments of musical occurrences or musical events. And that could be between days, that could be between hours, that could be within the same piece, within different sections that might be intended to be the same, but something contingent happens, and then the second iteration sounds completely different. So there's no relative box that contingency needs to be held in. It happens all the time. Contingency and chance can act on or be acted on by the performer before or during the event, but not just the performer, but the composer can also contribute to contingency in a piece of music. So the composer may provide a section, and we will see lots of these in our future analyses. They can provide a section of aleatoric patterns with a choice of pitch, and that's actually indeterminism that causes a contingency, which creates a different effect improvisationally. So some examples of contingency, there's lots of them, but here's just a few. We have deliberate or unintentional forgetfulness, process-based compositional procedures, which is what I just described with the aleatoric patterns, long-form performance of persistent repetitions of limited musical material. So this is where minimalism comes in with an improvisational feel. When you have, like with Philip Glass's music, when we have our one idea and he gradually either adds or subtracts from that idea, but after many, many repetitions. So it feels like this gradual morphing of sound. This can create contingency, not only in the effect for the listener, but also in what can happen for the performer. The performer may, lose their spot or skip a 16th note or something that causes them to get off and have to react in that moment and either make something up until they get on or wait until they get back on. And if they're waiting, you're losing that sonic addition that performer contributes to the larger group. So it, like I said, it can be on purpose. It can also be on accident. There can be deliberate destabilization of sonic continuity. So this might be when a performer or composer decides to use an alternate fingering on a flute, which destabilizes the tonal center, but it creates a different effect of the overtone series and the harmonics that you're hearing. So it has a particular goal, but you have to destabilize the pitch to achieve that goal. Instrumental preparations, so like the prepared piano, when we add paper clips to a guitar, things like this creates chance events, honestly, that, you know, these things rattle in different ways every time they're played just based on the laws of physics. Electronic sound making processes, interacting with electronics live, or having a fixed sound that you can interact with freely. All of these things would be different types of contingencies. You can exploit environmental resonances and psychoacoustic effects. I actually do this regularly in summer when I perform, not really perform, or practice in my silo. So that's a natural resonating chamber, and I might react to the echoes differently in there than I would improvising on a stage or with amplification. And then hiding or revealing form and content by dynamic means. So this can be a more particular version of contingency, where I would say that generally the composer would probably put this into effect, but a performer might decide to have a whole bunch of hairpins that illuminate different parts of their melody, and then you can create this, you know, superimposed melody based on that dynamic placement. That would be an active contingency acting on the effect of a composite melody. So then we have chance. All of these terms, chance, contingency, indeterminism, they're very closely related with subtle differences. So chance is pretty self-explanatory. So elements that occur in a pattern of randomness or unexpectedness to be acted on in the moment of improvisation. So chance is not usually something that's prepared or like planned. It might be, you might have a contingent spot that's planned, but the chance that occurs within that contingency is like a little subunit that happens in a lot of improvisation. So some examples of this would be like group improvisation. So the group coming together as a whole would be the contingency, whereas the chance element would be you reacting to particular like chance arrangements of someone else's improvisations. So you have your big contingency group setting, you have your small interaction with the individuals in the group, and that's the chance. You can have open, unstructured forms that allow just like massive amounts of freedom, and just that level of freedom, you're always working on chance with your environment, with any other performers you're playing with the direction the music goes, with intensity and contour. All these things can be a result of the chance in an open, unstructured form. You can also have a freedom of choice with regard to tonality. Many jazz players might be playing two different tonal centers at the same time, and that can create psychoacoustic effects between the players and their environment that allow them to react on these chance partials and things like that. Then we have indeterminism. Indeterminism is, I like to think of it as creative ambiguity. I think these two terms go together really, really well. So it's where the really human element of improvisation comes in. So the indeterminism would be like those aleatoric patterns we've already talked about with contingency. The process of creativity that happens in the performer, you're given an indeterminate number of pitches or free rhythm or things like that, and just that level of indeterminacy and ambiguity allows you to put your creative touch on that spot. So it can't be interpreted literally and relies on the realization of the performer and the spontaneity of real-time musical occurrences. Examples of this would be like graphic scores with graphic notation, indeterminate pitch and time, which we will see a lot of in the pieces to come. Instrumental preparations again, acousmatic practices, perhaps you manipulate your environment on purpose in order to create, like in the silo, like you can't always plan how different frequencies are going to respond in a resonating chamber. I mean, you can with enough math and physics, but I'm not about to find those numbers out specifically. So for me, it's an indeterminate reaction. And then again, aleatoric and improvisational moments, and then some aspects of minimalism can come into this as well. So an example of indeterminism is I am in love with this graphic score. I think it's beautiful. It's a great moment for just realizing that as a classical player, you can have creativity and that you aren't always confined to the notes on the page. I think it's a great teaching tool as well. It allows students to step outside their comfort zones and explore. However, this one is a great example of indeterminism because the indeterminism actually changes throughout this score. So you have moments where you're rhythmically indeterminate, which are, we have these pitches. Oh, let me see if I can, I don't think I can get the, yeah. Okay, so we have these sections where our indeterminacy is actually pitch and rhythm. So we're given a contour basically. And with the density of the notes, we know that he wants it to be rapid but free and with circular breathing if possible. So we've been given a set of limitations, but with a huge level of indeterminacy within those limitations. So we can choose pitch, we can choose rhythm, we can choose, well, not so much intensity. The intensity is defined there, and so is the contour. But then we go here where pitch is no longer fully indeterminate, it's partially indeterminate. So whereas up here we can choose any chromatic pitches in that general zone, here he wants us to remain with these pitches that are encapsulated in the box. However, rhythm and when and pitch placement is indeterminate. Here we have an indeterminacy of time. Our pitch is determined now, but how long we sustain is not. That can go based on performer's feeling. Here we have ambiguous pitches. We have, basically we're given contour here. So we have contour and then these thick sections. I would probably interpret those as intensity or dynamic involvement. And that contour lasts for a while and it gets quite squiggly and crazy here. And then we go back to the indeterminate rhythm and pitch placement, but with determinate pitches. This is about as indeterminate as it gets in this box here. We are given feelings. We are given, which are 100% subjective across the board. So when we say relax or enjoy yourself, that can mean very different things between performers, and that can provide a very different result. All of these shapes and craziness, pretty much the only thing that's determined here is intensity. Everything else is completely open to interpretation. We go back to contour, we go back to density, but everything else in these are completely indeterminate, rhythm, pitch. Yeah, and then we have things that repeat here at the bottom again. So this is a great example of just constant indeterminism, but changing form as we go, and that creates a kind of like a pseudo structure for improvisation. So the ECIC model can be useful when determining sources of contingency, chance, and indeterminism. whether it's due to the environment, compositional style, improv style, performer action, audience interaction, all of these things. In this case, the compositional style is highly experimental. So we have that under composer experience. So I used my own experience with experimentalism and my bias towards it and all of those subjective things that are packed into the school. And this is my rendition of, or not rendition, but model of how I see this piece. So I wanted to track the composer experience, the improviser's experience, and then the overall composite aesthetic and how experimental that is. So as far as the compositional approach, it is highly experimental. I have it all the way almost to the top of experimental, because this isn't even, I mean, just the notation alone is experimental, let alone how he decides to organize this new notation. And then the improvisation, it's actually quite prescribed for improvisation. The only more prescription it could get is if it was like, always use these pitches or use these keys and things like that. But our intensity and our contour, it's pretty prescriptive, but it's also very open-ended. So this is one of those subjective things where an improviser might see this and be like, this is crazy experimental and loose-ended, I don't know what to do with it. And then you have other improvisers who are so closed off and choked by having to follow the right key at the right time with the right rhythms, matching up with their improvising partners, that they see this and they go, oh, I can breathe, I can, you know. So this is where that subjective quality of the ECIC model comes in. I find this to be relatively prescriptive. My general experience with improv prior to learning blues improv and all that stuff later in life, my first experience with improv was just making random sounds at random times in my silo, my country yard there on the farm. So to me, this actually gives me quite a lot of direction from what I'm originally used to improvising. So the improviser's experience, which I guess would naturally be my experience, I placed over, it is still experimental. I would say that to be less experimental, there'd have to be more pitch and key control from the compositional standpoint. So I do say it's experimental and very improvisatory, but there are more experimental processes. So there's a little bit of room to give here. And as far as the composite aesthetic, because each section is a little bit prescriptive, I decided to put this in between these two things, because you're going to get very different results from two different performers, but the general contour, the direction, and the development of the improvisation are going to be at least somewhat expected with this type of notation. So questions that Spence suggests considering while using this model actually become quite involved. So a lot of these questions work with contingency, chance, and determinism, and different aspects of each of those. So I'm just going to read through these quick. They'll provide a general framework for how I approached. I didn't use all the questions in all of the analyses. I tried to fit them where they were appropriate to ask, because some of them don't apply to every piece. But these are the basic questions that fueled my analysis throughout the rest of this presentation. So is contingency and chance the main focus of a musical work, or is it a byproduct of the events that enable it? To what degree does their improvisational output demonstrate reliance on pre-learned or pre-composed motivic patterns? So a lot of jazz music would follow this question. What kinds of diatonic patterns, chordal progressions, keys used, things like that. Like improvisation can get very prescriptive in different cultures too. Like Indian ragas get very, very prescriptive as well. And it's actually argued that they're less improvisational than a lot of experimental improvisers will accept. So how is their output affected by interactions with other performers, the score, or the environment? So all those contingent factors that we talked about. How do the composers deliberately or by process destabilize their performance environment in order to engage with contingent events as a driver for their discovery and new ideas? So this is all talking about composers' prior engagement to creating contingency for the performance. What chance techniques do they employ to place them in a particular spot in the experimental improv quadrant? Improvisational techniques, externally imposed processes, aleatoric sections, timing. So just basically analyzing what really is going on that allows for freedom and chance in a work that is inspired by improv. And then to what extent is this perceivable in the sound of the compositional result? Is it always going to sound different to the audience? Is it always going to be the same, etc.? Do they consider the score as an endpoint, a blueprint for correct performance, or just simply as a catalyst or a suggestion, a means to engage the performer in the realization of a musical work? So is it a blueprint or is it a guide, the score itself? Does the performance approach welcome approximation or inaccuracy? Sometimes the composition is heavily improvised in the process of making it, and then when you get to the score, it's very rigid and precise for the performer for later iterations of the performance. We actually find this later on with Craig Patillo's work. Is indeterminism caused by physical action, human or otherwise, due to the laws of physics, psychological reasons, or a combination of both, which we call psychoacoustic? So how the environment acoustically affects the psychology of the performer or listener. So for our first composer performer, we are going to analyze two things Robert Dick has put into the world. Robert Dick is one of my flute heroes. I've studied a lot of his works. I recently met him at the NFA. I plan to attend one of his summer programs in the future, but he has been heavily influenced by the great guitarists of the 50s, 60s, 70s. So his number one mention is Jimi Hendrix and Jimi Hendrix's whammy bar. And Robert Dick actually invented a flute head joint in the late 80s, early 90s, which is kind of just starting to gain traction in the flute world. But it is called the glissando head joint, and it's pictured here in this picture. So it actually has two prongs that hug your face, and then you can slide your flute. I think it's a minor third, might be a major third, so that you can bend pitches like a guitarist does with a whammy bar. So it provides a lot more flexibility in the smoothness of portamentos and glissandi, and also to the extent that you are capable of extending them. So prior to this head joint, we always had to model on my flute. We had to uncover the holes and then gradually, very slowly lift the keys and to get a glissando effect. With this head joint, all you have to do is pull your flute out and push it back in. And he uses this in the first piece we're going to analyze, which is Sliding Life Blues. This is actually a fully improvisational piece that was transcribed. Two versions of it were transcribed by Melissa Keeling. And we're going to use the first version because it corresponds with this video. And there's a whole set of analysis you could do just between the different versions of those improvisations. But I'm here to compare his improvisational style with his compositional style. So we're going to do the first version of Sliding Life Blues, and then Fish Are Jumping, which is another blues-inspired piece. So just quickly, we're going to listen to the first 30 seconds or so of each of these.
Sliding Life Blues will become clear as we go along.
Good. I just wanted to get into that B section. He actually starts improvising on a microtonal scale by extending the glissando head joint, and it completely changes the tonality, even though not a lot of the fingerings actually change. Okay, and then to contrast his improvisational feel, so quite free, not the freest improv in the world, because he is playing within the superstructure of the blues genre, but compared to his composition, which we will listen to right now, it is a bit freer. So let's listen to Fish Are Jumping again. This is actually Nina Asimakopoulos. I feel like I say that wrong every time, but this is actually Nina playing Robert Dick's piece. So it's not an exact comparison of his performance, but it is his writing. Yeah, we have a lot more development from there, but already it's got a more consistent rhythmic flow. Still a lot of bends, but they're much smaller bends. They're all within a semitone, whereas in the Sliding Life Blues they are much wider, much wider, and more rapid and smoother.
Sliding Life Blues.
Okay, so this is my initial analysis of the comparison of these two pieces. So we heard the A theme and then the start to the B theme, but we have the general idea of the B theme, and then Fish Are Jumping. So I split up Sliding Life Blues because these two themes are pretty drastically different, and we'll get into that in a second. But I placed the Sliding Life Blues A theme on the less experimental side. While it is still an experimental sound, comparatively to the B theme, it is a lot less experimental. You have your standard, I think it's E flat blues, and then you know, some glissandi and a variety of rhythmic structures. But then in the blues, the B theme, we're riffing on a microtonal scale. It's a lot more rhythmically free and complex, and it has a lot more textural variety. Okay, and Fish Are Jumping, definitely an actual composition. However, on the continua of compositions, I wouldn't put it all the way over here. I might place it a little more to the left, but there's actually moments that ask specifically for improvisation. And there's also like these overcomposed rhythmic sections that naturally just beg for freedom. To hear a blues player play those rhythms exactly right would be like awkward and not really soulful. So these overcomposed rhythmic sections, they're meant to be with free execution, and they're only like that because a lot of blues rhythms, you know, when they start riffing on little small intervals or limited notes to provide tension, the tension is usually built up in the rhythm, and transcribing that can be a little bit inaccurate, I guess. Okay, so just some different rhythmic, formal, and modal indicators about these pieces. I've touched on a few of these already. So Sliding Life Blues is fully improvisational. It has an A-B, 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 A theme, which is almost like verse chorus structure that you might find in blues, where it just alternates between different ideas, but with like a semblance of motivic integrity kind of being reflected across the sections. Oh, I said E flat blues before. It is E blues for the A theme, and then there's a microtonal blues for the B theme, which I will show in a couple slides here. So this particular improv requires the glissando head joint. You can get away with it on a normal flute. You're not going to get the depth of reach between pitches that kind of marks the quality of this piece. In general, very free rhythm. It's can be a little bit not rigid, that's not the right word. It can be a little bit developmental intentionally. But again, that's a very blues thing to do, to gradually kind of like the additive process Philip Glass uses, but rhythmically. So they might start on a quintuplet and then add on to the sextuplet and then add on to a septuplet, so on and so forth, things like that. In Fish Are Jumping, this is a fully composed piece with moments of contingency and indeterminism. It's much less reliant on the microtonal depth of modality we see in sliding life blues, but it does still use microtones in bending and splitting octaves and things like that, where we will provide microtonal qualities throughout. This is a ternary form. It's ABA. The B section is definitely very long, and it's kind of split up into 4 developmental ideas or sections. But as a whole, it is very much like, here's an idea, here's a bunch of new ideas, and then here's the return of the original idea, almost verbatim. And this is actually built on the F minor blues scale, and it doesn't really deviate much from that. So commonalities between the two of these is that they are both in blues modes, which is obvious. I mean, it's basically in the name. They both alternate triples and duples rhythmically, which is again a very standard blues element. They both have a very heavy use of extended techniques, and extended techniques on the flute provide a ton of contingency and chance, and allows for more variety of indeterminism. There's a general sense of metric time. It's not as rigid in Sliding Life Blues, but he definitely isn't one of those 3-meter composers. Usually, I'm sure he has a few pieces out there that are, but these two are very much like not very free metered. We actually find that the 8-bar blues comes in both of them pretty free. He changes it at times. It's not strict, but he does try to adhere to the 8-bar blues, 12-bar blues. There is recurring themes in both of these. So that kind of puts it a little lower on the experimental axis. So if we go back here, so the B theme is pretty experimental. The B theme, when it returns, it has a lot of variety even in its returns, but you can tell it's the B theme based on like texture and the microtonal scale. But these other elements, well, yes, he is doing some experimental things. They're not rhythmically or metrically crazy. So there are a lot of ambiguously timed glissandi in these. So the Fish Are Jumping, while it is a metric piece, it's still for flute alone. So there's a lot of space for rubato and personal interpretation. So instead of hanging on to a gliss for 2 beats, you might add on a beat there if you're really getting a good slide in, and then you can come in right on the downbeat and reestablish the meter. And that like suspension of time is also another commonly found element of blues music. So I think that it's an appropriate Fish Are Jumping, especially. Both are we've already mentioned a lot of different elements that are standard to the blues tradition. So I would say that both of these pieces are pretty formulaic to the blues tradition. A lot of rhythmic freedom. And then they frequent, oh yeah, so we already said that we have ambiguous time glissandi and a lot of extended techniques, but the use of the bends are meant to imitate the whammy bar in both of these. Whereas bends in Wil Offermans' work are usually meant to imitate the shakuhachi. So with improvisation, it is a largely imitative tradition. So these artists are going to take their influences and inspirations and use them as moments of imitation. In this case, Robert Dick uses glissandi in both of these to imitate the whammy bar. We have these stretched moments in both of them with long, almost lyrical passages, and then with like interjections by technical licks, which is usually how a blues guitarist will like show off. They'll have these like crybaby moments and like just soulful, like pulling emotion out of you, and then they'll just release all that tension with a super fast technical awesome riff. So I have some experimental considerations for the theme A and theme B. It looks a little bit weird. So we have the motivic, oh, I see what happened there. Our motivic occurrences in the theme A, they're not exact, but they are very obviously similar. So this is kind of a genius thing that Robert Dick does with his improvisation is he can remember like exact things that he did minutes ago earlier in the piece, like 10,000 notes ago, and then he can take the idea and then develop it. So we see in measure 10, which is where the introduction turns into a real theme. We have this slide from this C sharp undertone. Oh, sorry, no, that's when the diamond note head is above the pitch, that is indicating that the glissando head joint is pulled out. And then he pushes it in. We can see that with the eye, and then does a tremolo on it and comes down into two more slides and lands on a tremolo E. So here we have the same thing. We have the glissando head joint extended. We gliss up into this tremolo E. We come down on the D and B, but then we go back up. So he's developing it and he's creating this repetitious pattern. So this D connects the same repetition of the E and the D following it. And then instead of 2 slides, we have 4 slides on the a fifth above. And then we still end on the tremolo E. So very clear relationship between these two moments, between measure 10 and measure 54 and 55, but also in an expanded and developed way. So this piece also relies heavily on repetition and geniolas. So this is where that contingent factor can come in with heavy repetition, especially with improvising. It can get really contingent. Your rhythm can start to change. You can react to it by adding in crazy articulations to make the repetition more varied and developmental. This is the general transcription that Keeling did, by the way. So I have her credited down here. It's straight out of her dissertation. So he actually is quite a bit freer with these moments, but there's no good way to notate that that's functional. So if you're going to create a transcription that's even semi-functional, some stuff has to be simplified, but also understood that this is a transcription of an improvisation, and these moments are probably going to be a bit freer. So if someone were to take this score, they might really get into this repetition, and they might add on measures and add in articulations and maybe some percussive articulations, da 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 dee da 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 da, something like that. And then his use of rhythm here is pretty standard for blues and the way that they're grouped. So he plays 4 of these sextuplets, and then he's got 8 of these octuplets, and then 8 of these quintuplets. It's a pretty standard development. The only thing that would make it more standard is if you were going from like 5, 6 to 8, but so he changes the order a little bit, but it's still pretty standard blues feel. So the rhythm in theme A seems to be free at times, but it's pretty metric overall. And Keeling was able to show this by giving it a meter. It's in 4/4. But there are moments of indeterminacy in this section. And this being the most rhythmically obvious one, he actually riffs on these, let's say it's 7 or 8 times. I didn't count exactly, and neither did she. She just put repeat signs because he loops them. They're really, that should be marked with like loop for a while or something like that. But he loops them, and he also changes the articulation pattern slightly between the loops. So that's a moment where if one were to learn this improv and put their own touch on it, they would definitely have that moment of indeterminacy to make some creative decisions. And then, of course, the glissando head joint is always going to create like an indeterminate microtonal result. You're going to, you might stop somewhere unexpectedly and get a different landing pitch than was expected, or the speed of which you glissando can have an indeterminate effect as well. Theme B, we have our microtonal scale, finally. So we have the entire microtonal scale is pulled out on the glissando head joint. So it creates these different partials that our ears aren't used to hearing. I think it sounds really cool and shimmery, like there's still kind of a tonal center, but it's all just a little bit messed up. It's kind of like a little Twilight Zone. So the sounding pitch is indicated with the filled in note head, and then the fingered pitch is the diamond note head. So when you pull the glissando head joint out, the instrument gets bigger and it gets lower. So our fingered pitches are going to be higher. So it's the opposite of a harmonic. Then we have very much rhythmically freer than theme A. I think this alone can argue why it would be placed higher on the experimental axis than theme A was. These rhythms are very much an approximation. So the B section starts here. These rhythms are very much an approximation of what he's actually playing, but they're a pretty good approximation. It definitely gets a lot more like subtly uneven, but even here, like these are much more erratic and free rhythms than one would normally find in a composed piece imitating the blues or anything like that. So here's another moment of indeterminism. In general, I probably would have mapped the contour for this instead of prescribing the exact partials that are being used. Because this looks confusing to a performer, and you're never going to get necessarily this same result. And also, he's so rapid and just erratic here that the rhythm again is a little bit estimated. And yeah, so I think just having a general arc would be enough for a performer to take this section, imitate it properly, but you're always going to have an indeterminate outcome with when you're working with overblowing partials and on the same fundamental. You can work at it and get really close, but everybody's flute is physically different. So just the laws of physics alone, everyone's mouth cavity is different. So it's one of those things that is indeterminate and is going to sound a little bit different from each performer. In Fish Are Jumping, we have some moments of true compositional moments. So there's a clear motivic structure with theme A between measure 1 and the return 1 before E. So we start on this really wide portamento or glissando. I like to think of portamentos as when we're sliding off the keys, but so, and then that follows into this triplet drive with slides in each of them, or bends in each of them going up. And then the same wow here, ending the motive. I think the motive actually ends here. Click on the next page. And then E, the same wide portamento into the same triplet drive with bends in the same spots. I believe all the pitches are even the same. So yeah, very, very clear motivic structure instead of the natural improvised developed structure, but this is like copy and paste. So the bends are a bit more prescribed in this particular piece. Obviously, it's a composition and it's composed for people using a regular bang flute. So we're not going to have the wideness of the glissando head joint. So he wants to give us goals to work towards. However, again, everyone's flute and finger action is different. So we might have some semitones that arrive out of nowhere. So the repetitive intervals with slight rhythmic variation. This is standard in creating blues tensions. I've already talked about this briefly. So we can see here this, I might be able to demonstrate a little bit here. Read that in a couple years, but so that repetitive but slightly different action with the slide, landing on the F, and constantly sliding up at different timings. This creates like this persistence, and then it breaks when we can finally just like riff. Ending there, but we can kind of see how this drawn out persistent interval just like ends this explosion of blues improv, basically. I mean, it's written, but this was clearly an improvised moment, especially when you compare it to a lot of the rhythm that we saw in Sliding Life Blues. Stuff like that. The experimental considerations in Fish Are Jumping, we have transitions from multiphonics. In this case, they're largely broken octaves, but we go from multiphonic to monophonic, and this I consider a moment of contingency simply because of the laws of physics. They can have a less than exact feel. It's a very ambiguous motion, just naturally. And again, with everyone's flute and oral cavities and everything being different, they might break the octave where the higher partial is louder than the lower, or vice versa. You can practice and get really good at balancing the two partials, but not everyone takes that time, because it does take a lot of time. Then there's a lot of overcomposed rhythmic freedom that we already briefly discussed. But here's a great example where this isn't necessarily overcomposed. This is pretty doable. These multiphonics are pretty standard beginner multiphonics, so they're going to sound much easier than some of these broken octaves will. Because broken octaves are 100% just air direction and then shape in your mouth, whereas these multiphonics rely on different fingerings that create air breakage down the tube of the flute. So this first part is pretty standardly prescriptive, where it's going to sound like how it looks. But then we get into this dectuplet and these just really rapid note firings. This was just clearly improvised spot that compositionally that he just kind of tried his best to get the most approximate measurement of rhythm, but almost every time you hear it played between performers, it's going to sound slightly different. It's just the contour is the same and the direction is the same. There's also an indeterminate placement of partials, but we do have a determined contour. So, so here we have the voice, we're getting louder. The partials are just going to kind of do what they do as you crescendo. Again, this is something you can practice, but is going to be slightly different between performers. Rehearsal D provides opportunity for more approximation of rhythm and performative bends. So this indeterminism is caused by physical action. This whole section at D, it's like a whole page. Excuse me. The whole page, you can just bend and twist, and a lot of these rhythmic durations, they're more estimates. And this isn't something that's prescribed by the music where it says freely or anything like that. It just kind of happens as you get into the feel of the blues and everything. These partials underneath, the fact that there's no stems, they're just note heads, means it's rhythmically indeterminate. And durationally, it's technically not indeterminate, but it kind of just happens. Okay, and then his final compositional decision for indeterminism, this would be an example of a composer deciding prior to the performance, or not the performance, the publishing, that this is a spot of improvisation, of full contingency. And he even says in his notes and in interviews that this section was not supposed to be like a classical cadenza where you go back and you take motives and you write them down and you might riff on them a little bit, but ultimately it's composed by the performer, and like people even write them down and sell their cadenza. It's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a free expression of where you're emotionally at as a result of everything you just played before. Some people do it for a very short time. When I played this on my senior recital in my undergrad, I improvised for at least 45 seconds. I also had a pretty big crowd of blues lovers from back home who were just waiting to hear me go crazy. So I kind of milked it a little bit. But yeah, so that is like a very open-ended improvised cadenza. Making Fisher jumping quite experimental. All right, so up next we have Greg Patillo. Greg Patillo is an American composer and performer who I believe he got pretty big on YouTube with his flute improv with beatboxing. So he takes a lot of hip hop styles and brings them onto the flute with his group called Project Trio. So Greg Patillo was commissioned to write a competition piece for the National Flute Association's Young Artist Solo Competition. And so he did an interview with one of the NFA members and talked about how he would actually set up in the subway and perform these improvisations with his beatbox stylings, and then he would listen to the recordings and take ideas that he liked that he had done and then formed them and manipulated them into these compositions. So his compositional style was exceedingly experimental, especially as far as contributing to the repertory of a classical instrument like the flute and the types of things that the NFA commissions. However, the compositional result is pretty rigid and less experimental. We'll talk about aspects that are experimental for the the performer, not an improviser in this case. But yeah, let's just get a an idea of what each of these sound like. Okay, so we have our first beat. So far we hear these little interjections that kind of break up the beat, but so far a lot of repetition, and the beat is a little more consistent in what the audience can expect with, stops here and there. Here's the second beat. So far now in this beat, we hear the voice is actually the main driving melody. The flute becomes more percussive with the vocal beatboxing. And then he comes in about 35, 30 seconds and introduces melodic material with his voice, which for a young performer requires a lot of ear training and practice. So it's a great challenge for competition, of course. And then our third beat. Yeah, so in the third beat, we're hearing a much more complex beat behind it. This one is actually a little more unpredictable. It does have an overarching pattern that we'll look at later, but what is interesting about this one is that the flute is acting as the primary mode of melody again, and there's been a clear melodic development into the beat material. So with all of these things in consideration, oh, there we go. This is where I placed each beat from performer experience and composer experience on the experimental axis. So let's start with composer because that's where the process starts. We have the first beat, second beat, and third beat. They're all fairly close to the same spot. There are textural and compositional approach differences in each one, but they're pretty subtle. Overall, they're experimental in that we have the use of vocal beatboxing and commercial music influences, different ways that the flute is being utilized functionally, different ways that the voice is being utilized functionally, and then I have it right on the line of improvisation and composition because the process was improvisational, but the result was very compositional. So I kind of split the difference there and put it right on the line. And yeah, all of these things kind of apply to the second and third beat as well. I did make the third beat or the second beat a little more on the improvisational side because there is that element of the voice, and that is very reliant on every individual person's ear and their register and their voice. Some people might have to get more creative to make it work. Others might pick up on it right away, like if you have perfect pitch. So that is where some contingency and indeterminism can kind of creep in. But the first and the third beat, I did say that the third beat was more experimental, largely in that it's a much more complex beat. The interaction between the melody and the flute and the beat itself. There's some ambiguous rhythmic things he had to notate. So it is just slightly more experimental in my opinion. The performer experience is quite a bit different. The scores are very rigid, which we will see shortly. They everything is metered to the T. There's no intentional compositional aleatoric sections for chants encounters. In general, this was commissioned to play in a very controlled environment. So as a performer, it is somewhat experimental in that we are learning new notation, which we will see in shortly as well, new notation and the vocal beatboxing in addition to the flute. And I probably could have raised that a little more on the experimental side, but in the grand scope of experimentalism with electronics and extended techniques, all that stuff, it still is a bit tame in the experimental world. And as the performer, again, it's just very prescribed. There's not hardly any room for deviation. So our main rhythmic, formal, and modal indicators. In the first beat, we're in F minor very consistently. It's basically one giant hemiola. And then we'll see that in the rhythm and the score. It changes slightly here and there, but if you took out the vocal beatboxing, the actual score itself is almost Philip Glass-esque, where it just changes slightly, and then you'll have a clear section change eventually. So within that hemiola structure, there are interjections, and we find some form of interjection in each of these. And as we relate it to the hip hop genre, I like to think of these as, moments of call outs or whoops or any of those moments. In this case, almost every single rhythmic interjection is an F harmonic minor scalar interjection. The beat is relaxed with transitional moments of compressed rhythm. So the actual vocal beatboxing is a lot broader and has more space. And then as it drives into the next section, he's got a 30-second little tag that connects the two. This one is an ABA ternary form. The second beat is in G minor, again, very consistently. It is a pretty much constant 16th note drive from the vocal beatboxing standpoint. So already significantly more complex in beatboxing than the first beat. The primary melody, again, is in the voice instead of the flute. So that is a moment of potential contingency for a less experienced vocalist flautist. This one seems to be through composed. There's almost no motivic recurrences. It starts very sparse, just beatboxing. Flute gets added in gradually. Voice gets added in gradually. The two converge more more consistently, and then they end in this big sound. The third beat is in C minor. It is the most dense movement rhythmically and melodically. It's an ABA binary, and the beats do not hold a strong pattern, but there's a clear motivic repetition paired with melodic motives. Many transitional bars connect beat ideas. Again, all three of them. There's almost no room for indeterminacy, chance, or contingency on the performer's side. The entire piece is reliant on pre-learned motivic patterns. Patillo suggests these are learned by the loop. So he just says, like, take 3 or 4 measures and loop them as many times as you need, and then, you know, tag on the next 3 or 4 and gradually build the piece that way. That way the vocal beatboxing becomes internally memorized, basically. There's, like, again, no room for like rubato. It's very rhythmically, here it is, it's set. And it's also all three are very repetitious with the beat, but that's a common trope for hip hop, just like we saw with Robert Dick's use of standard techniques in blues. So one of the biggest experimental considerations of Patillo's work is his notational contingency. So he had to create, as we see in these screenshots, he had to create a percussive sound, notated with letters, and then the check marks are inhales, but those are paired with certain consonant sounds. And then he uses a mordant for the flutter tongue, actually, which I thought was interesting. Note heads with aeolian sounds, or aleatoric, not really aleatoric. It's more of an airy tone percussive sound. Those are with an X note head. And then here, all notes under a dotted slur denote a diaphragmatic attack. It is like starting the note with a H, more attack than slur, less tongued. So these are notated in the third movement as a bunch of 16ths, but they don't sound like 16ths, and they're not attacked traditionally. So that is another point of contingency compositionally. All right, so here we have the first beat score. This is the entire 2.5-ish minute piece. And we can see that it is quite rigid as far as rhythm is concerned. It's consistent 16th notes pretty much all the way to the end. We've got a couple of rest spots, but even in there, the vocal beatboxing is filling in those 16th notes. Here we have our first example of the rhythmic tag or rhythmic transition. The whatever, I'm not a beatboxer. But that's much faster and pushes into this reiteration of the theme A material here. We have the theme comes back on the final page right here, the last 5 measures. But it is the theme material for measure 7, not for measure 1. So it brings that beat in right away. However, the beat doesn't stay exactly the same as it is done at 7. It gets a little more developed and busy here. Great. So contingency and chance here again comes in the compositional process of just finding the beat patterns, doing the improv to find the melodies. But then what Greg Patillo did is he strung it all together to make an actual composition, which is why it falls so far left on the composition axis. Experimental elements for the performer is basically the beatboxing itself and then interacting with the contingent new notation. You know, he made up this notation for this piece, and just learning that aspect of it creates contingency in our execution, especially since we have such strong variability between size and shape of people's mouths and their experience on the flute and everything. In the second beat, this one employs some deliberate destabilization by using the voice the way that it does, with the voice coming in on this third stave, again, extra notational contingency. We have this less reliable pitch access that creates potentially unintentional contingency. So what happens if you're half step off, or if you're nowhere near the mark? Do we stop and restart? Do we keep going? Do we start creating something new because we can't find the pitch center again? All these things can happen in live performance. It's also interesting that the flute is largely percussive, as you can see by these X note heads. Every once in a while, we have a little melodic interjection until the very end when we start to get a little more simple. And then we have the flute alternating with the voice. So you have this back and forth call and response with yourself. So that's kind of a jazzy element, actually, and jazz is a predecessor to hip hop. So it makes sense that it would come in hip hop and in Greg Patillo's writing as well. So the beat is staying steady. We have our flute say something simple, then our voice replies with the same thing, but then they diverge. So we create a wedge where the flute goes up, the voice is coming down, and then it changes a little bit more as you go. But even still, even with these extra contingencies, the score should still be considered like a blueprint instead of a suggestion. In the third beat, so we have these dotted slur guys. So down here we can see that. Oh, let me get my laser pointer back. Laser pointer. Okay, so right here we have these dotted slurs that don't actually sound like consistent 16ths. It's more of like an accent sound. And then we have the beat often like fills in the space. I personally haven't figured out how to get that effect on my own flute yet, but I plan on spending a little more time with this just because it's fun. So temporally, the audience is going to perceive this with a little more contingency than what the performer is going to feel, because we have these super steady beats, right? But then we have these like cascading, metrically different interjections. So we go from regular 16ths and then we add in these sextuplets. Same thing with the septuplet, so on and so forth. It changes time for the listener when you have the removal of a groove or the beat, and then you're kind of suspended in time while there's this flurry of notes that are completely placed differently from everything you just heard, and then you bring the beat back in. So there's these like seemingly indeterminate moments in time for the listener. Again, as a performer, it's different. We have everything metrically organized in our brain. We have the score in front of us or have it memorized. So that temporal suspension doesn't feel quite the same, but from a listener's perspective, it does feel a lot different. Great, now we have Wil Offermans. So Wil Offermans is a Dutch flautist and composer. He actually spent a lot of his time in Japan learning the ins and outs of the shakuhachi from traditional Japanese teachers. And he's written many pieces relating to the shakuhachi and shinobu and other Japanese flute traditions. So he has a very drastically different approach to improvisation and composition than both Robert Dick and Patillo. They both used a lot of commercially accessed music and turned it into this post-tonal flute sound. Wil Offermans does the opposite. He takes ancient traditions and uses Japanese aesthetics to create a much different listening experience as well as performative experience than the other pieces that we've analyzed so far. So a lot of his pieces will be a lot more broad and not necessarily as technically active all the time. He has a lot of technically active sections, but a lot of it is exploring the different colors of the flute. And while Robert Dick does a lot of that, this is more, Wil Offermans does it in a more ambiguous, amorphic way that allows you to timbrally explore different vastly indeterminate techniques, which we will see many shortly here. So we'll be comparing Honami and Ilios. So Honami is a composed, written down, published piece of music, one of his more famous solos. And then Ilios is it is a complete improvisation, just for flute alone. And Offermans has done this in several settings. We're analyzing the recorded version that's on Spotify from this album right here, which is the Ilios Live album. So let's go ahead and listen to just a few seconds of each just to see how our general vibe is changing from the pieces we've looked at so far. And that's the same pitch with different colorings. Lots of microtones. Now if we skip ahead, that's exactly. We have this melody enter, almost 100% based on the overtone series of 3 pitches, which I analyze very closely later. Great, and then we have Ilios, which is going to take us to Spotify. Oops. Let's skip ahead a bit. Whistle tones. It'd be hard to hear. Oh, that was a great moment of indeterminacy. Yeah, so we have an idea of the kinds of textural differences that we see with a lot of Offerman's music. What happened to my stuff here now? Slideshow, here we go. Okay. So Honami and Ilios both have an interesting difference in composer, performer, and audience experience. So Honami, her composer experience required a lot of improvisation and more experimental use of rhythm, microtones, extended techniques, moments of indeterminacy and contingency. However, the performer experience, we come over here to the solid blue X, and it's very much composed, but it is still very experimental because of those moments of indeterminacy and contingency. So it's improvisational, but in a really prescribed way still, which is why it still falls in that compositional quadrant. The audience experience, it sounds less experimental, especially when compared to Ilios. And that's because you're going to hear the same basic structure across multiple performers, but there's going to just be slight time differences. So it's a little experimental in that some time will be stretched and pulled, some bends will be deeper than others, things like that. But for the most part, you're going to get a consistent performance out of it. Ilios is much different. So our composer process is even more improvisational. There's nothing written down. This is just Wil Offermans. He has some ideas and techniques, and he just expands and develops them in whatever way he's feeling that day. The performer experience, if you are not Wil Offermans, like if I were to take my transcription and perform Ilios, it would still be highly improvisational. There was almost no way to actually track a lot of these rhythms with these key flicks and things. So I decided to use graphic notation, similar to the etude that I displayed first in this series of analyses. The audience experience is also going to feel very improvisational and experimental. So that I have all three of these unfilled X's for Ilios up in this improvisation experimentation quadrant, nearly in the same spot. Again, the audience is going to experience something different every time. There's going to be a lot of different psychological engagement with the long stretched colorful tones where we're just changing timbres. Like there's almost 30 seconds of just the intro of Ilios where it is all just B natural and we're just gradually changing color through the B natural and dynamics. And the audience is going to superimpose expectations and beliefs that they have on music by hearing that. There's less of a prescribed, I should like this. This sounds this way because of this. It's a lot more open-ended on how the audience can receive it. Okay, so Ilios, it's fully improvisational, much more rhythmic, and harmonic partials used to create indeterminacy based on like one idea. So he'll take one pitch and then add like 4 or 5 fingers, but then you have complete freedom with those fingers about what to do with them. The audience will experience something different every time, like I just explained. There is a restricted fundamental range, so the fingered pitches that are notated. However, there's an extremely wide overtone range, and it kind of allows a lot of the melody to be driven by overtones and whistle tones and things like that, which is something that we also find in Honami to a certain degree. It's actually happens more in Honami, well, now that I think about it, a little less in Ilios. In Honami, we are fully composed. It's ABA ternary form. I think that, did I say Ilios is through compose? Every once in a while, some aesthetic things come back, but it's hard to call them motives. In the intro itself is fully through composed. So in Honami, there'll be slight differences in timing and effective use of techniques, where we have moments of indeterminacy, but overall the audience will know what to expect between performances. The melodies in the middle of Honami are completely built on an overtone series of C, C sharp, and F. So, and when you're trying to analyze these melodies, it's almost impossible to do it without considering the fundamental pitch. So both of these are displaying shakuhachi elements. So tone bending, tone color, key flicks, which would have just been finger flicks on a shakuhachi because they're open hold. Variable vibrato, so using vibrato as a color. Then to do this, he has to actually destabilize many of the techniques on the flute by using alternate fingerings for diffuse tones, like bamboo tones and things like that. There's also a lot of use of broken octaves, which is a very common destabilization that Robert Dick uses very frequently. So both of these have a tonal center that return to B. However, the melodic modal language differs a little bit between the two. The Ilios relies on that B and then like half steps around that really heavily, and then Honami again is building a lot of its melodic material on the fundamentals or the overtone series of those three fundamental pitches. Both have a lot of rhythmic ambiguity and indeterminacy, and both are very much unmetered and free. There was almost no way to meter Ilios without just relying on the recording timings. Both are also heavily reliant on microtones. I think I've mentioned that. And there's also a lot of semitone relationships intervallically between these two pieces. So here is Ilios. So contingency and chance is like the main focus of this particular recording. So we have this, even this is a little more metered than it actually feels. I counted about 12 seconds. So a lot of this is based on like the quarter equaling basically 60 BPM, like you were running the clock. You have these portamentos. Those are going to be variable between people and their effectiveness. And then we have these moments of complete open-ended, flicks and harmonic reaches. I tried to map his overall contour and then try to see if I can place like some patterns in there. So there's some loose patterns, but it goes so fast and is so just random. It's just random sounds. It's an effect. It's a technique instead of a composed pitch and rhythm melodic structure. That happens quite a few times. And this one happens for quite a long time, like almost 35 seconds. Here's another one where I just mapped the contour and showed which keys to flick. And these thicker keys that I showed, but with the holes open, those are with the ring key compressed, but with the tone hole open. So you'd have, in this case, I'm looking, laser pointer back. I'm looking down here. So this one would be fully closed. These ones, you'd bring your fingers back and flick them off of the tone hole. Then there's almost no pre-learned patterns. It's all ambiguous. The only pre-learned thing you would have to know are some like alternate fingering options. I tried to find the closest alternate fingerings that used or that caused the same overtone series that he was producing. But aside from that, it's all very free. So it's very reliant on tone colors, pitch, and to get these different more microtonal things and tone colors, you regularly have to destabilize the pitches like we were talking about. Anytime there is an alternate fingering, that is a destabilization. The pitches on the flute were given very specific fingerings to keep them stable. And when you change that, you're absolutely, it took centuries to find the right fingerings and the right bore holes, sizes, and positionings and everything. So by changing those fingerings, it's intentionally destabilizing what we spent centuries stabilizing. Then a lot of chance techniques include timing these aleatoric riff sections. And I even it was so weird to notate, I just would put these lines, which he uses a lot in Honami, and then just say gradually more chaotic for 20 seconds. So you might be counting, probably not if you're improvising your feeling. Players' physical ability to stretch certain portamentos properly. So some players might have a deeper portamento ability than others because it takes a lot of coordination. So that's kind of like a physical ability, chance, contingency. And then contour. Contour is very variable at times. This is a suggestion. This is just what he does. But if you're improvising, that might look very different. Perceptual indeterminism from ambiguous freeform. So The form for Ilios, like I said, is basically through compose. You might have kind of motivic textures, but it's not a lot of motivic melodic activity. So you get this feeling of timelessness. Like the first time I listened to the entirety of Ilios, which is about 15 minutes, I transcribed the first 3 minutes. The full 15 minutes felt like 5 minutes to me. And I looked down and was like, oh my God, that's 15 minutes, because the form is so free and the techniques become so interesting that time is temporally perceived much differently than if you weren't listening to it, from the audience perspective, at least, in my opinion. Let's see. Okay, so for Honami, we actually have a lot of similar things happening. So a lot of our contingency is happening with indeterminate rhythmic structures, like right here. And here we have our melodies built on the overtone series. And you have to track the overtone series to get an idea of where the melody is going. Right here, anytime we turn the flute in or out, that's destabilizing our sound. And that can create some interesting effects, especially if you're new to this type of music trying that. And then this is another moment of destabilization. And we'll get into a lot of these specifics. I want to first look at the modal analysis of the overtone melody. So what I did here was I tracked the top pitches and I assigned a number to them. And I just numbered 1 through 13 based on the pitches that were present. So I took a analysis of what exact pitches even show up, and it's not all of them, it's only these 13. And then the bottom is always these 3, C, C sharp, and F, 4, so right below the staff. And that's just 1, 2, and 3. So we see the pattern 1, 3, 2, 3 consistently. 1, 3, 2, 3. All of these highlighted moments are all 1, 3, 2, 3. Then we start having these non-overtone pitches come in. Sometimes they are within the 13 pitches. Every once in a while they're not. I actually missed one of them. So in this page, I had to put in an 8.5. So over here, B natural would be 8.5. But what we find is that the pattern doesn't stop, at least at first. So we have 1, 3, no overtone, 2, 3. So this pattern is still present. It's just we have an additive process happening, like Philip Glass does in his works, which also starts messing with time. So it's pretty much consistently groups of 4 until we start adding in these additive non-harmonic pitches. Oops. Okay, so then we go back to our pattern, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3. It comes in. We have another additive, this time with 2. However, we see that our 1, 3, 2, 3 is still very present. 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3. Another additive, still sticking to the pattern, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3. So this one's very stretched. Not only do we have, 3 non-harmonic pitches, but we have a new pitch entirely, this B flat here, that's held out. It suspends time for a second and stretches it out, which makes it feel a little improvisational, actually. We go back to our pattern. We have another very additive process here. And then the texture starts to change. We start shifting into the next section of Honami. So this is all happening from the cantabile section all the way to here. And then we have our A theme come back right here. So we have this overtone harmonic series happening up until this transitional return to theme A. And in this case, we have more and more overtones come in. 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3 over here, 1, 3, and this is the first time our pattern changes. So we have that B flat come back, but then we have this interruption of space here, or ma, the Japanese ma for a contemplative, but also preparatory space of silence. So then we go back into our pattern 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, even though it's interrupted and additive again. and then 1, 3, additive, 2, additive, 3. So it's gradually getting stretched more and more, and our overtones are being used a little less and less. So we have 1, 3, 2, 3 again here, but again, even more stretched. Then we have a whole bunch of pitches, 4 to be exact, that are fundamental pitches, no overtone series. And then we come back to our pattern, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3 with additive, 1, 3, 2, 3 additive. And then we end on 1. So we almost create this harmonic language of C and C. So in this case, it's 1 and 4. Normally, we're coming back to 1 and 9 or 3 and 9. So the C natural is the most prevalent by far. I could also map out how many times each pitch occurs, and we could find the tonal centers very specifically that way. So I thought this was a really interesting way to build a melody, and it sounds like a melody. It doesn't sound completely random, so it's honestly pretty cool. Some experimental considerations in Honami, we already discussed a few of them, but it's basically rhythmic and metric freedom as well as irregular motion. So even though we have this cantabile that seems metered and stuff, it still is very free rhythmically to the performer's intentions. And then we have this gradually faster rhythm recurring. I think it happens 2 or 3 times. And whenever there's an extended fermata where you can stretch time for a really long time, he puts these long lines, which I tried to use a little bit in the Ilios transcription. Indeterminacy is also caused by physical action, such as techniques that are less predictable by the laws of nature. So we talked about this idea of destabilization already, and these are some of those specific moments of intentional destabilization that he decided to do compositionally. And then here's some more deliberate destabilization, where we use alternate fingerings for the same pitch, and it creates this very different tone color. And that fingering might be different for different flute models. And then we have our harmonic melodies built on the 2 fundamentals, and then the bending of the gliondos. So it's already being destabilized with a timbral trill or a tremolo, and then you're turning the flute in and out and destabilizing it further. So it's like a destabilization on a destabilization. So that is Honami and Ilios. And if I were to put these 3 composers on my own ECIC just for them 3, I would say that Offermans is definitely more in the improvisational experimental quadrant. Dick would probably be more on the middle line, and Patillo would be more on the compositional experimentation side. I don't think any of these would fall into the less experimental side. But if we're going relative, I would say that probably Patillo is less experimental, mainly because he's so prescriptive in his compositional style and doesn't allow for performer indeterminacy. So conclusions, all of these performers, their first step was improv and experimentation and just trying new things on their instrument. And then they add in their own influence and inspiration. Greg Patillo had hip hop, Wil Offermans had the shakuhachi, Robert Dix had the blues. He does lots of other things as well, but in this case, we focus on the blues. And then all of these come together to create very different results all across the board of just massive creativity and just a really great profile of the diversity of musical expression in humans. Some of the implications, there's also conversations happening about the massive potential of the performer composer and writing more for improvisation and incorporating that into compositions, and then deciding, well, who gets the credit then? Who do we put on the ledger line for program notes and things like that? People have done both, like Melissa Keeling does loop pedals works, and she builds the loop pedals for you, and then you improvise over the top. So in my recital, I credited her, but then I put in my program notes that I was improvising. So I still gave her all the credit for her work. This is her sound, but I'm putting my own little touch on it. So it also allows us to understand various tools and contingencies for spontaneous musical events. So the aleatoric patterns, the timing changes, the different contingencies between the audience and performer, all these things can be considered when creating new experimental pieces. And it can honestly radically change the performance experience in the future. And I think it already has. And I think we're living on a continuum of performance experience change. We can also use this as a teaching tool. It can allow perspective for students to see, compare different pieces in a really accessible way. Like it's very personal, and you can put things where you want and be able to draw conclusions. I'm also going to play around with using it as a practice tool. Like maybe my student wants to map different contingencies in their music and create intentions for how indeterminate certain things should be. Like we're looking at the graphic notation. Maybe the one with all the crazy pitches can be less indeterminate than the one with just the contour. And that can give the student a basis of understanding on how to approach those two different sections. And with that, I say experiment and be free, and let's keep making crazy, awesome, creative music that allows people to really enjoy their sonic experience and think a little deeper about what they're listening to, while also being free and unrestricted. So that is my presentation on 5 different pieces of post-tonal flute solos and 3 composers, and how I would use the experimental composition and improvisation continuum model to help learn and process these pieces. Thank you.